Hello and welcome to Stones and Stories, a web-only documentary for TriStatesRadio.com, courtesy of Tri-States Public Radio. It's where we go to various cemeteries around McDonough County and explore the historical significance and really what it means for history in this region. I'm joined by noted local author and historian John Hulwis. Our first stop in this series is the Old Macomb Cemetery. It sits along Wigwam Hollow Road here in Macomb near the corner of Adams Street. And John, what can you tell us about the cemetery before we get started? What's historically significant about this?
Well, it is our oldest Macomb cemetery and one of the oldest in all of McDonough County. It's in a lovely location here along Wigwam Hollow Road, and as you look to the north, you can look down the hill toward the Lemoyne River, or Crooked Creek as the pioneers called it, which was the location of the early Indian encampment that gave Wigwam Hollow its name.
Now, was there any particular reason that the settlers of this cemetery decided to choose this location? Is there anything special about it?
No, it really wasn't. It had to do with the early death of a youngster that started things here and started the development of a private cemetery for several years before the public took it over. And that death occurred in the family of Peter Hale. Peter Hale and his wife had a quarter section of land in this area. They built a log cabin on it in 1830, and later in that very year, their little daughter, whose name we do not know, fell into a fire and was burned to death. And so she was buried near the log cabin here in what later became the cemetery. Unfortunately, we don't have a record of her death more specifically than that, and we don't know the exact site of her grave, but that was the very first burial here in what later became the Old Macomb Cemetery.
Well, John, what's our first stop on this tour?
I can take you to the second burial here in the Old Macomb Cemetery, which occurred early in 1831, and for that we've got to go to the middle of the cemetery.
Okay, well, let's go. Okay, so we've arrived at our first stop, the gravestone of, it looks like T.L. Bowen. What can you tell us about this?
This is a Bowen family headstone. Of course, it's a 20th century stone, but and it mentions the names of a number of people in the family, but also that of Truman Bowen, who was the second burial in this area. Truman Bowen, a pioneer who died in March of 1831, just a short time before Macomb was going to be laid out later that year. Truman Bowen, who died of disease in his 40s, was born in 1786. And there's a story that survives about his burial because it was so early and Macomb hadn't even been established yet. There wasn't really any cut wood in the area. That is, there were a lot of logs, but not cut lumber. And so a problem was what to build his coffin out of. James Clark, a very famous pioneer from our county, offered his wagon that he had used to bring his family from Kentucky. So they took that wooden wagon apart, reused the lumber to make a makeshift, at least, coffin for Truman Bowen. And Clark quipped that it was a rough, box-looking affair that didn't give much inducement for people to die in McDonough County. But that's the second burial in the area, and of course it still was not a public cemetery and wouldn't be for a period of time, and for that we've got to go to the next stop.
Okay, the next stop on our tour is the headstone of one Robert Garrett, and John, I hear that Robert Garrett played a really important role in the 1800s here in Macomb.
He did, not that he was an important public figure, but he sold the land to the community to make this a public cemetery, and that was in 1835. He himself was not buried here until 20 years later, 1855. But he was born in 1770, and so he's one of 28 people in this old cemetery who were born before 1800. An interesting thing about his particular stone, which is lying down flat here as you see on the ground, is that it also has a poem on it. And in fact, if we look closely at the poem here, and we can just still make it out, and in fact, it's a rather common poetic epitaph, very widely used in New England since Puritan days, and beyond that in Europe. And it goes this way: "Behold, you strangers passing by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you shall be. Prepare for death and follow me." So a very grim reminder that everybody's got to die. And you can sense the Puritan cultural background in that kind of poem. But it was used, again, widely, and we don't know who originally composed it. But the point is that they liked poetry on tombstones. At least certain cultural groups did, especially those from the East Coast. And so you find a number of headstones here in the old Macomb Cemetery that have poetry on them.
Now, it seems as though, as you mentioned, it's a rather grim poem. What caused the? I guess we have a different perception of death these days. It's not so much grim as some religions, celebrate it. It's not something to be feared. What caused that change?
A lot of things contributed to it. It would take an hour and a half to talk about the causes. I think I have taught classes in changing attitudes toward death over the years. But in the 19th century, the earlier view of death as a grim, horrific thing that everybody has to face, and of course the judgment coming in Christian terms after death, was replaced by the notion of death as a sleep or a rest. So if you go, for example, in Macomb's Oakwood Cemetery, which reflects later in the 1800s, you'll see more common references to at rest, asleep, things like that on the stones. So they softened the notion of death from what it had been traditionally, going all the way back to the Puritans.
Well, John, what's next on the trip?
We're going to take a look at another early figure from who was here in the 1830s, who was a very important early minister. He was a prominent early minister who came to Macomb in 1837. James M. Chase, he was from New Hampshire, where he'd been born in 1800. But a very successful Presbyterian minister, and he not only was a minister here in town and also a teacher, incidentally, at our very first college founded by the Presbyterian Church, McDonough College. He taught there from time to time, and also he helped found a number of other Presbyterian churches in the region. So a well-known minister. In fact, he was also from a famous family because his uncle was Bishop Philander Chase, who was the chief bishop in the Episcopal Church in the United States, and was the chief founder of Jubilee College, for example, now a state historic site over by Peoria. So he was from a family of ministers, very prominent figure, and it shows, I think, in the size and nature of his stone. He didn't die until 1865. He was actually on a mission, a Christian mission, to help Civil War soldiers. It was shortly before the war ended that he passed away. I mentioned his prominent family. His father, also a minister from New Hampshire, who had been in Indiana for a long time serving the Presbyterian Church there, is also buried right over here.